Weather has always been the maverick factor in war. It has influenced and sometimes decided victory or defeat. It has halted armies. More men have died from adverse weather conditions and the diseases they allow to flourish than have perished in battle. It may be bone-freezing snow and ice, or searing heat. It may be choking desert sandstorms or cyclones at sea. Or it may be torrents of rain turning landscapes into vistas of mud that suck soldiers down to death as easily as quicksand. Weather has used many ways to ruin the plans, the strategies, and the hopes of even the most brilliant generals. But the result is always the same. When weather works against one's plans, it has the capacity to torment all who fall into its clutches.
A lot of the influence of weather on military campaigns depends on where in the world you are. If you are in the Mediterranean, on land, the weather is far more predictable. If you're out there in the summer, it will be hot, it will be dry, you will get no rain. All you've got to do is make sure that you've got water. And then there are parts of the world where the weather is far more influential.
I suppose the earliest example that we have is in the sea, when the Persians were invading Greece. We had the Battle of Salamis for 480 BC. But there are other examples. Invasions across the English Channel seem to get delayed almost always by the weather. And this is true from William the Conqueror, Henry V going the other way.
And then more recently in D-Day, the other way round, even though by then, of course, we're not talking about the mercy of the wind affecting sails, because none of the invading crafts were sail-borne, you still had a situation where the weather was absolutely critical to the success of this enormous mechanized force landing. So armies, when they set to sea, could never be sure that they would arrive at the other end. The weather was the critical factor.
When a Mediterranean ruler, King Philip II of Spain, set out to invade England, one thing he did not plan for, because he had no clue about, was Northern European weather. Was the fact that a storm can blow in from the North Atlantic without warning, and all it took was one good blow, and a lot of his ships were on the beach in Calais roads, helpless. And it shows that unless you have the intuitive understanding of the weather in the theater where you're going to operate, you can plan every detail and the weather will screw you up in the end.
Of all the countries in the world where wars have been fought, Russia has shown most forcibly how puny man and his efforts can be compared to the awesome powers of nature, and how notions of invincibility will crumble in the face of its might. When Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Russia in 1812, and in 1941 Adolf Hitler did the same, both of them were riding high and proud on the crest of military success. Their invasion armies were the largest of their age. Both had conquered European empires, Hitler within little more than a year. With its massive snowdrifts, ice that froze rivers and lakes several feet below the surface, and driving winds that seemed to cut through to the bone, the climate of Russia was barely livable for those unused to it or unaware of what it could do to armies, their equipment, and their ambitions. It was one thing to know about the Russian winter, quite another to experience it, and what was more, experience it as armies did, vulnerable, out in the open, and surrounded by hostile territory, whose inhabitants burned their own homes and removed all food and supplies, rather than let the enemy have the slightest succor or aid. In Russia, as Napoleon and Hitler were forced to realize, the frozen earth of winter was also the scorched earth of sacrifice. The accounts of the soldiers who endured this punishing ordeal by climate were remarkably similar, despite the lapse of 130 years. In 1812, one of Napoleon's grenadiers wrote in his diary, "It is so cold that the crows tumble frozen from the sky. Our nostrils are choked, our mouths filled with lumps of ice, and ice needles which the wind drives into our faces make us blind."
All things considered, from a Russian point of view, the weather is very fierce, it's very extreme, and it's very unpleasant for humans and for machines.
If you're going back to extreme cold weather marches like the Second World War and Napoleon and so on and so forth, they didn't have any para-wings, they did have heavy equipment, they didn't have the right sort of clothing, and the fact that they died in droves is not surprising.
When we're thinking of the Russian winter, we are apt to think of the whole of this mass, which is enormous. But Moscow is only about 35 degrees east, and so really the Siberian climate was never experienced by either of these armies. They suffered worst when the winds would be from the east and brought the wind from the very cold regions, or on occasions, of course, from the Arctic.
On the 24th of June, 1812, Napoleon's Grand Army, 600,000 strong and equipped with close on 1,200 pieces of artillery, crossed the river Niemen and entered Russian territory. With a force that outnumbered the Russians by more than 2 to 1, Napoleon believed, like Hitler after him, that a few quick victories and a few short weeks would suffice to score his latest triumph. Napoleon was so confident that his troops went to Russia dressed in their summer uniforms.
Napoleon had to expect that he could get the Russians to a decisive battle, defeat them in a decisive battle, and get his army back to wherever in Europe they came from before the really cold weather started.
Napoleon didn't know how long he intended to stay in Russia. He was never terribly distinct about it. And indeed, in June 1812, he was talking about the invasion of Russia not being a business of a single campaign, but of 2 campaigns. So basically, Napoleon was keeping his options open. I might be able to do it in 1 campaign season, but more likely 2 campaign seasons.
Napoleon's first halt was at Kovno, where he established a headquarters for 3 days. At this juncture, the biggest problem for the Grand Army was not extreme cold, but extreme heat and drenching rain. Napoleon pushed on to Vilna. The Russian roads were poorly made and soon became quagmires of mud. The horses struggled and carriages were immovably stuck. Further on, as the Grand Army struggled on towards Vitebsk, many carriages had to be abandoned and the horses began to die, 8,000 of them between Vilna and Vitebsk alone. Already, it seemed, things were going seriously wrong. Napoleon's plan after crossing the Niemen had been to push between the 2 main Russian armies, one, led by Prince Michael Andreas Bogdanovich, consisting of 127,000 men north of the river, the other, a force of 43,000 men, under the command of Prince Peter Bagration, between the Niemen and the Pripet marshes, and smash each of them in turn. But Napoleon had reckoned without the enervating heat that exhausted his cavalry before they had a chance to join battle. The horses, too, were in a parlous state, due to an outbreak of colic. Despite these drawbacks, the French had a chance to outflank the Russians and thrash both their armies as planned. But the chance slipped away, and towards the end of July 1812, the Russians retreated eastwards across the river Dnieper. The French set off in pursuit. As the Russian withdrawal went on, they were drawn deeper and deeper into the huge expanse of Russia. Napoleon managed to catch up and bring the Russians to battle at Smolensk on the 17th of August and at Valutino on the 19th. After Smolensk fell, the place was in ruins, and corpses, some of them burned, were scattered around the streets. When Napoleon moved on from Smolensk to Vyazma, he found the city in flames. Further on, he found the Russians had stripped Zatsk of salt and bread, and in temperatures topping 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the water supply was crucially low. The next battle, at Borodino, 70 miles west of Moscow, was indecisive. Napoleon was ill, and as the Russians retreated towards Moscow, there was no pursuit. Borodino was fought on the 7th of September 1812. Napoleon and the Grand Army, already depleted, exhausted, hungry and sick, were by this time 700 miles inside Russia, still facing an enemy that had eluded defeat and, what was more, refused to accept it. And when the French finally entered Moscow on the 14th of September, the enormity of their situation was all too apparent. Burning Vyazma had been only a small foretaste. Moscow, by contrast, was being swallowed by fire. On orders from the governor of Moscow, most of the population had been evacuated, and the Russians were torching the city. The conflagration lasted for 4 whole days. By the time the wind direction changed and a shower of rain quenched the last of the flames, 80% of Moscow was left a smoking, blackened ruin. Already, Napoleon had lost at least half his men. If he stayed in the Russian capital, the rest would surely follow. They had to leave.
Napoleon spent 5 weeks in Moscow, and during that time he discussed a number of options. It wasn't immediately apparent that he would actually have to withdraw from Russia. In fact, this is one thing he didn't intend to do. And for a while he played with the idea of advancing on St. Petersburg, because if Alexander wouldn't come to him with an offer of peace, he would go to Alexander and he would take the Grand Army, or the 100,000 or so he had left, to Petersburg and dictate peace terms.
If Napoleon had been able to move his army into the houses of Moscow and had been able to winter over in Moscow, perhaps one might say they could have sheltered from the cold. And if the Russians had not left a big pile of food for Napoleon's soldiers to eat, then they would have starved. Wouldn't have mattered that they had shelter. They'd have starved.
He must have known about the Russian winter. He had people around him who'd visited the court of St. Petersburg and so on. Relations between Russia and France were relatively close, and the travel between them was quite normal. Even then, I mean, it was slower than now, but it was really quite normal. So the Russian climate was familiar to French people. Why didn't he make contingency plans? Megalomania, expectation of success. This is what he'd had, really, and he suddenly didn't meet it.
Napoleon left Moscow on the 19th of October. With him went 87,500 infantry, 1,470 cavalry, 533 guns, and a train of around 40,000 wagons and carriages. Next day, Prince Mikhail Kutuzov, stationed south of the capital, received orders from Tsar Alexander in St. Petersburg. Only 2 words: attack Napoleon. Kutuzov ignored the order. General Winter, he knew, would dispose of the invaders without his interference or the risk of further loss to his forces. Naturally enough, Napoleon meant to take the shortest route out of Russia and marched his army to Kaluga, south of Moscow, to begin the trail back west. Some 12,000 Russians under General Dokhtyrov were deployed across Napoleon's path, having dug in just outside Maloyaroslavets, about 31 miles from the capital. Dokhtyrov's forces were no match for the Grand Army, and the French managed to smash their way through the Russian lines on the 24th of October. But it was, in its way, a Pyrrhic victory. Napoleon realized that the main Russian army, commanded by Kutuzov, had occupied positions along the southern route he had hoped to take out of Russia. This forced Napoleon north, obliging him to follow a route through Smolensk and Berezina that was longer by 50 miles, or 2 days' march. This was more or less the reverse of the route the Grand Army had taken to reach Moscow. The French were revisiting the places where the Russians had already burned and destroyed most available resources, and they themselves had already pillaged what little was left. When the French left Maloyaroslavets, they had no food or supplies to take with them, and by the 28th of October, the first hard frost had arrived early. 9 days later, on the 6th of November, the first snows began to fall. This was when the worst suffering began. As winter closed in, temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there. Icy winds blew the snow into deep drifts, obscuring the road and piling high around the legs of men and horses. Wrapping coarse canvas sacking around faces and feet made little difference. Before long, exhaustion was added to hunger, as was fear of the merciless Cossack horsemen who were shadowing the French, ready to seize and kill stragglers. Once caught, stragglers had no chance. They were stripped bare and prodded along by Cossack lances until they fell dead in the snow. Either that or they were sluiced with water which turned to ice in minutes, then tied to trees and left to die.
The French developed an enormous fear of the Cossacks. They did not respect them as soldiers. The Cossacks wouldn't stand and fight, but the Cossacks were always hovering around, just behind the next hill, just behind a forest. And if you did become detached from your unit, if, for example, you were out foraging, then you stood a very good chance of being captured by the Cossacks. But the real fear the French had is that the Cossacks would simply hand them over to partisan groups. And they take their revenge in the way the powerless always take their revenge, in the most unpleasant way possible.
The French gained belated revenge on the Cossacks at Krasnoy, where Napoleon's prize troops, the Guards, slaughtered them on the 14th of November. But already the Grand Army was a pitiful parody of its one-time pride and glory. They had reached Smolensk on the 10th of November to find no food and no supplies, only reports that the Russians were concentrating their troops once again, ready to cut the escape route. Leaving Smolensk, the French reached the river Berezina on the 25th of November, only to find its surface a mass of ice floes and the icy waters too deep to ford. Nearby, at Studianka, Kutuzov's Russians were waiting for them, confident that here at last the French could be defeated once and for all. Kutuzov told his troops, The end of Napoleon is irrevocably marked. It is here, in the icy waters of the Berezina, that his meteor will be extinguished. He was wrong. He had seriously underestimated the skill, enterprise, and near suicidal courage of Napoleon's sappers. The French began a perilous crossing. Battered by ice floes and progressively weakened by the troops, wagons and cannon passing over them, the bridges gave way many times. The sappers jumped into the water to shore them up, but the ice floes crushed many of them to death, and exposure did the rest. Now, even Napoleon, whose letters and dispatches home had been so optimistic, had to accept the plight of his soldiers. "Our army," he wrote, "is not a good sight today." Even this was greatly understating the case. The Grand Army, once described as a force which for 2 decades made Europe tremble, was finished. Only those who managed to survive yet another week of storm, snow, ice, and temperatures as low as 38 degrees below freezing managed to reach Smorgoni, near Vilna, on the 4th of December. Their agonizing journey was worsened by stomach cramps, diarrhea, and hallucinations caused by the extreme cold.
The human body is a very delicate, self-regulating instrument in some ways. It has to function under certain narrowly defined conditions of humidity and temperature and things like that. Fortunately, the planet Earth is filled with places where the human race could evolve under conditions ideally suited. However, if you go to a part of the planet which is not warm, then you are in danger of having your body temperature drop so far that your body's compensating mechanisms can't deal with it.
If this gradually falls from its normal 37 down to the low 30s, then it may become uncontrollable, and all the mechanisms inside you just slow down. You stop digesting your food, you stop generating any fuel, and the whole system just collapses.
Although they were, of course, more accustomed to their winter than the French, the Russians had not been immune to the depredations of winter. The 100,000 men of Kutuzov's army, for instance, was reckoned to have lost more than 2/3 of its manpower within a few weeks. But the French, fighting far from home in hostile foreign territory, suffered a great deal more. According to the Prussian general Karl Maria von Clausewitz, the advocate of total war, out of the 600,000 who had followed Napoleon into Russia the previous June, and including the reserves and reinforcements who joined them later, only 48,000 were left. Disease, starvation, lack of adequate shelter, or poor medical care accounted for a large number of casualties. But the cold, the remorseless cold, was the greatest culprit of all.
Napoleon's Russian campaign was absolutely a military disaster. Because he took such a huge army with him when he went into Russia, it was a huge disaster.
How far was the weather responsible for it? The weather was the final straw, I guess. He almost got away with it. Really, it was only the last few weeks of the return to Poland that exposed his soldiers to the real rigors of the cold winter.
What killed Napoleon's army was not the weather. It was that Napoleon took his army to an inhospitable place. Because Russia is so huge that the day you take the decision to invade Russia is the day you lose the war.
When Napoleon invaded Russia, he took with him a copy of the Life of King Charles XII, written by the French philosopher Voltaire. A century earlier, Charles, King of Sweden, had preceded Napoleon in Russia. His invasion took place in 1707 during the Great Northern War, and in all its essentials prefigured Napoleon's experience. Charles, too, allowed his army to be sucked into the vastness of Russia, stretching his lines of communication, supply, and reinforcement almost to vanishing point. Like Napoleon, Charles, too, had been trapped by general winter, and his troops were cruelly decimated by ice and snow. In the end, after a 3-day battle at Poltava in the Ukraine in July 1709, most of the Swedish army had to surrender. Only King Charles and 1,500 of his men, out of an original 17,000, managed to escape. In 1812, Napoleon had been confident that he would not repeat the mistakes King Charles had made. It was an arrogant assumption. Those who do not learn from history are destined to repeat it is a well-known dictum. It was certainly proved by Napoleon, and Hitler proved it again in 1941.
There were enormous changes in the 20th century. So Charles XII and Napoleon would have known in general terms about the climate. They wouldn't have had any figures because the figures didn't really exist, and they wouldn't have thought in figures. They would have just known that it would be very cold in the winter and hot in the summer and humid in the marshes, and would have expected their armies somehow to cope.
Hitler, on the other hand, is someone who had scientific meteorology. He had a highly developed meteorological service, and as a result, they were far better able to use the meteorological information they had than anybody who came before them. But you must keep in mind that weather is a chaotic system. It is a complex system in the sense of complexity mathematics. It is a system so complex that what you get out of it does not directly relate to what you put into it.
On the 23rd of August 1939, 10 days before the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin signed a non-aggression pact, and within little more than a month, they had carved up Poland between them. But the political ideologies of Communist Russia and Nazi Germany were complete opposites, and their pact was a charade. Virtually everything Hitler had done since coming to power in Germany in 1933 had one overriding aim: the subjugation of the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe and the seizure of their lands as Lebensraum, living room for the German people. In this, the dismemberment and colonization of Russia was a top priority. The Russians, for their part, were suspicious of Hitler, and in 1939 and 1940 took the precaution of creating a buffer zone that meant their virtual takeover of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and a major part of Finland. Joseph Stalin, nevertheless, found it difficult to believe that Hitler would embark on another war in the East, when his war in the West, where Britain still defied him, had not yet reached a successful conclusion. Russian military leaders, wiser in the ways of war, read the runes more accurately. In the spring of 1941, they saw what it foretold when Hitler occupied or made treaties with Balkan countries that lay along the southern flank of his invasion route. The invasion of Russia by Nazi Germany began on the 22nd of June 1941, when 162 divisions, around 3 million men, crossed the Russian border along a 2,000-mile front.
We could have a look at the chart for around the time that Hitler began his invasion. It was what, Sunday the 22nd of June? This would have been about the time that the troops would have started to move 4 o'clock GMT in the morning. So it's early morning, 6 o'clock here, about the time of nighttime minimum temperatures. And here's a 54 in Poland, Fahrenheit, 12 Celsius, 55, 54, 12, 50, 10, 52 near the coast there, 11 Celsius. And it's dry and fine, good visibility by and large. A good morning for launching an invasion.
The invasion force was the largest used in war up to that time. But like Napoleon, Hitler did not expect them to be at war for long. The Russian army, he believed, was badly trained and badly equipped. After the purge of the military between 1937 and 1939, the Führer deceived himself that the Russian commanders were second class. Russia was a giant, but a giant who could be easily toppled by the mighty forces of Nazi Germany. 4 months of blitzkrieg, Hitler reckoned, would be enough to finish the job. This was why, like Napoleon before him, Hitler sent his troops into Russia without winter uniforms and cold weather jackboots, or weapons and equipment that, unlike the Russians, were not winterized.
Adolf Hitler war der Ansicht, wir würden Russland in einem Jahr besiegen und hat in keiner Weise daran gedacht, die ganze Truppe mit Winterbekleidung auszustatten. Wir hatten lediglich leichte Kleidung an, die für den Sommer und für die wärmere Jahreszeit vorgesehen war. Mehr nicht. Und das Böse kam noch, denn in dem Winter 41, 42, 42, 43 hatten wir in Russland Minusgrade bis zu 45 Grad Frostwetter und im Sommer bis zu 40 Grad Hitze. Und diesen Unterschied, den musste man da auch verkraften. Und es hat sich nachher herausgestellt, dass an der Front es viel mehr Verluste gab durch Erfrierungen der menschlichen Glieder als durch Tod oder Verwundung seitens des Feindes.
Although the Red Army had expected an invasion, its speed and power knocked them off balance. The German Center Army Group raced across the countryside, creating pincer movements that trapped 290,000 Russians at Minsk and another 100,000 at Smolensk. By the 19th of July, the Germans had also captured 4,500 Russian tanks and 3,300 guns, and Center Army Group was already heading for Moscow. Despite phases of simmering summer heat, up to 104 degrees Fahrenheit at times, vast distances were covered, putting an immense strain on the German supply lines. But the blitzkrieg raced on. Even Army Group South, under the command of Field Marshal Karl von Rundstedt, which had more difficult terrain to cover, had almost reached Kiev, far to the south, by the 3rd week in August. Kiev fell on the 19th of September, and 665,000 Russian troops surrendered. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe pounded the Soviet Air Force, destroying 4,500 Soviet planes. By September, the Germans had reached the Crimea and were driving for Sevastopol. In early October, in the north, they were invading Leningrad. 2 weeks later, in the south, they were threatening Rostov and Kharkov. The campaign in Russia seemed to be showing all the hallmarks of rapid runaway success. At first, this had certainly been true. But was this really going to be a rerun of France and the Low Countries, where in 1940 Blitzkrieg had scored such brilliant victories in only 6 weeks? Hitler's 4 months were due to run out on the 22nd of October, and by then, his armies were still 40 miles from Moscow. Worse still, the strains of the lightning advance were beginning to tell. Some German army units had lost 50% efficiency, and the infantry was not much better off. Exhaustion and frustration ran through the ranks. The Russian tundra had proved harder to cross than the Germans had imagined, and the difficult terrain in the north had slowed their advance. Experiences like these ate away at German confidence and faded the prospects for a quick, decisive triumph. By October, autumn had begun, with torrents of rain that turned roads into thick mud. November came, and with it the onset of winter, and still Moscow eluded the invaders. After the shock of the initial assault, the Russians had been in disarray, and 3 million of them had died in the first few months. But by the time autumn and winter arrived, they had been able to make good their losses in material and had drawn on their huge population for new recruits. The Russians brought in as many as 100 divisions of fresh troops, all accustomed to the freezing Russian winter, all imbued with an iron resolve to preserve their homeland. As had once been said of the Americans in their war with Britain in 1812, they knew what they fought for and loved what they knew.
What the Germans miscalculated upon, well, a number of things, but was the resilience both of Soviet will and Soviet capacity to fight. During the summer of 1941, Stalin and his subordinates were able to tap into the vast resources of the Soviet Union, manpower resources, equipment, raw materials and so forth. Sometimes in an efficient way, sometimes in an inefficient way, but nonetheless to generate the combat power long after their forward deployed armies have been destroyed, to continue engaging the Germans in attritional fighting.
This then was the caliber of the Red Army that barred the Germans' way to Moscow. The Germans managed to cover some fresh ground to within 25 miles of the capital, and some German patrols even managed to reach the suburbs, where they caught sight of the Kremlin. But Moscow remained as elusive as a mirage. As temperatures, compounded by the wind chill factor, plunged to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the German advance came to a halt all along the line. Hitler, infuriated, had already fired von Rundstedt, and now he relieved other generals and took personal command. This, even more surely than the Russian winter, promised total disaster for the Germans. By the end of 1941, when a Russian counteroffensive had driven them out of Kalinin and Kaluga near Moscow, the Germans were facing not one enemy in Russia, but 3. Determined to keep the Soviet Union in the war, the British and Americans were supplying the Russians with weapons, ammunition, and almost every other type of military equipment. The Germans, meanwhile, had no such help, nor realistic hopes of any. Like Napoleon's troops, they were freezing to death in their inadequate uniforms. In an effort to protect themselves, German soldiers wore 3 pairs of long johns, or several layers of women's knickers, and supplemented them with whatever they could steal from Russian corpses. Russian felt boots and long, heavy greatcoats were especially sought after, and in German-occupied areas of Russia, the local inhabitants were stripped of all or any warm clothing.
Ja, und dann ging das bis vor Moskau. Dann kam die große Kälte. Ich leide heute noch dran, Zehen erfroren. Ne? Und wenn ich mir diese Mütze nicht besorgt hätte von toten Russen, da wären meine Ohren auch weg. Und dann war da ein Leutnant, der hat mich angeguckt, war in Ostpreußen. Mein Jungchen sagte, du gehst wohl nicht gut zu Wege, ne? Ne, ich sag, mir ist schlecht. Ja, sagte, nach Hauptverbandsplatz. Da kamen die Verwundeten hin und die eben krank waren, wie ich, am Umfallen war, Füße schon erfroren, die Zehen, hingen die Strümpfe schon dran. Ne? Mittlerweile hatten wir 40 Grad Kälte. Da ging bei uns maschinell gar nichts. Und der Russe, die von Sibirien kamen, denen die MG ging, die Motoren liefen, wir hatten ja nicht mal Kühlflüssigkeit. Stellen Sie sich das mal vor, bevor wir alle stehen gelassen haben, da muss ich jedes Mal das Wasser ablassen, ne? Wenn wir eine Nacht da gelegen haben, zwischendurch den Motor laufen lassen. Ne? Wir hatten gar nichts, wir waren grundsätzlich auf den Winter gar nicht vorbereitet.
When it became clear to ordinary German soldiers, in particular those nearest the front line, or at the front line who were the least well provided with winter kit, that the resources available to the German army way back in Poland or in Austria or Germany were not going to be available to them personally, then clearly they had to take some fairly radical steps simply to stay alive, let alone to keep on fighting. And unfortunately for the local population, if the German armed forces could not provide the things that the German soldiers needed to survive, then they were the ones who were going to have to do so.
Hitler's concentration camp system was systematically stealing every fur coat from every Jewish person in all of Europe. And one of the basic forms of winterization that the Nazis used was to take the fur coats that they'd stolen from people they were gassing in central Poland and put them on vans and take them out to the soldiers freezing in the Eastern Front, and they could turn these fur coats inside out and use them for warmth. They just thought it got a little bit colder than Germany. Campaigning in the Soviet Union was like going to another planet to campaign, and they weren't prepared for life on this other planet.
The Germans' weapons were as unsuited to the winter conditions as their clothing. The firing pins of their rifles snapped in the cold. Breeches froze solid. So did the crankcases of tanks and trucks. Frequent stops on the march to allow the men to warm themselves made for delays in troop movements. Mobility was severely hampered. The air was bitterly cold and breath froze within seconds. Snow was waist deep in some places, and stumbling could be fatal. Fall over, and a man could be frozen dead within minutes.
In war situations, you've got the big problem of not getting killed by the opposition, compared with the equally big problem of mentally and physically deteriorating through being exposed to the elements, possibly in a trench where day in, day out, you've got to cope with mud, you've got to cope with other people's blood and dead people around the place. You've got to cope with rain, possibly non-stop for day after day, week after week. It's going to be an enormous mental drain, as you can picture, and certain people can't cope with it.
German weapons, which are far less winterized than Russian weapons, don't work in conditions of extreme cold. They don't work when they get muddy, and this is a huge problem for the Germans.
Und das war der Fall. Das Maschinengewehr, das ich sowieso nicht recht bedienen konnte, wie ich Ihnen schon erzählt habe, fing dann an zu stottern. Und im Winter war es, die deutschen Maschinengewehre arbeiteten bei großer Kälte ja kaum noch. Besonders die während des Krieges eingeführten Maschinengewehre Typ 42.
If you ever see a Russian car or a Russian weapon, they're clunky. You drop the thing and you hear all sorts of noises. But the point is you can pick it up and they work again, because they're designed to operate under these conditions. German motor vehicles, German locomotives, German weapons were too well engineered. A great irony.
By January and February 1942, the Russians were attacking along the entire front, from Finland in the north to the Crimea in the south. Though forced on the defensive for the first time, the Germans besieging Leningrad retained their stranglehold, and elsewhere, the all-round defensive areas known as hedgehogs kept the Russians at bay and averted a headlong German retreat. When spring and summer came at last, the Germans fared well. They managed to eliminate salients created by the Russians during the winter, and in July 1942, they captured Sevastopol. Then, new orders and a drastic change of plan reached the German armies from the Führer in Berlin. Now Hitler ordered two major drives, to Stalingrad in the north and to the Caucasus with its valuable oil reserves in the south. Strategically speaking, this was madness. Dividing the strength of the armies in Russia meant reducing manpower for both operations, and the gap that opened up between the two drives, north and south, left free a mass of Russian troops who were not directly involved. In the event, the Caucasus campaign, which began on the 13th of July 1942, achieved only minimal success, especially after it was crucially weakened by the withdrawal of the 4th Panzer Army. On Hitler's orders, and in the face of strong protests from his commanders in the Caucasus, the panzers were sent north to bolster the 6th Army under General Friedrich von Paulus, which had become involved in a struggle that was, in every sense, a fight to the death. The battle for Stalingrad began on the 24th of August, 1942. It was one of the most ferocious confrontations of the war, more like an atavistic struggle for survival than a modern military operation. It went on through another merciless winter of snow, ice, and freezing, cutting winds, before von Paulus was forced to surrender on the 31st of January, 1943. By then, 200,000 Germans were dead, and Stalingrad was a mass of gaunt, snow-covered rubble. The ferocity of the Russian winter had claimed legions of men over the years. Its force, underestimated by military giants who simply failed to allow for extremes of temperature and environment. The mighty Napoleon tamed nations, but he didn't identify one of his most dangerous enemies until it was too late. Even for Charles, the King of Sweden, the Scandinavian cold could not prepare him and his men for the treacherous Russian winter. At Stalingrad, the tide of the war in the East turned decisively against Hitler and led all the way to Berlin in 1945 and the destruction of the Third Reich in the blood, flames, and ruin of total war. Although the Russian winter was not the only factor in all of these legendary defeats, for the third time in less than 2.5 centuries, it had shown what it could do when faced with human pride, ambition, folly, and gross miscalculation.